One of the unusual things about Latin is that it's impossible to talk about the pronunciation of the language without also talking about its history. 2,000 years ago, Latin was the language of ancient Rome, and as Rome grew into an empire, the Latin language grew with it. But Latin was not and is not just the language of ancient Rome. In this class, we're going to use what's called the restored classical pronunciation, which is our best approximation of what Latin would have sounded like in the 1st century BC. Spoken Latin became the everyday language of the western provinces of the Roman Empire, a role that was filled by Greek in the eastern provinces. But over time, in the Western European provinces, Latin remained, and it evolved into the modern Romance languages, into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and the dialects related to those languages. But while spoken Latin, everyday Latin, was changing into the various Romance languages that we have now, Latin as Latin remained in use in a number of different areas. For example, Latin was the language of government in Western Europe for centuries after the fall of Rome. That's why important documents, like England's Magna Carta, which was signed by King John and various nobles and clerics on June 15, 1215, was written in Latin. Latin also continued as the language of scholarship. So when the first universities were founded during the Middle Ages, instruction, naturally, was all in Latin. This tradition of Latin as the language of scholarship continued through the Renaissance, when great thinkers and writers like Erasmus and Thomas More wrote in Latin. To this day, many university and college diplomas are still written in Latin. We can still see the importance of Latin in the technical vocabulary of a wide range of professions. In the legal profession, for instance.
Hi, this is Bo Baez, and today I want to discuss the torts concept res ipsa loquitur, a Latin phrase which translated means the thing speaks for itself.
Literally hundreds of technical terms are taken directly from Latin. The same is true of medicine.
When emergencies happen and panic sets in, Stat Emergency Center is here to treat any major or minor emergencies.
In fact, English draws more than half of its vocabulary from Latin, even though English is not one of the Romance languages. Latin is still the official language of the Catholic Church as well, as it has been for almost 2,000 years. For most of that time, up until about 50 years ago, all Catholics would have heard the Mass in Latin every Sunday, even though now Mass is most often said in local languages, modern languages. Latin is still the official language, and some Masses are still conducted in Latin.
Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu tuo.
Even at Masses in the local language, Catholic Church attendees are still likely to hear some Latin, particularly from the enormous treasury of traditional prayers and chant and hymns that have been composed in Latin over the centuries.
소프라노 도수미 씨의 축가가 시작됐습니다.
파니스 안젤리쿰이라는 라틴어 성가인들의 천사의 영식이라는 뜻입니다.
Now, music has been composed for Latin texts outside of the religious context as well, in the past and even today, a tradition that continues, for instance, with Norwegian composer Ola Gjeilo. And the Irish performer Enya. By the way, those last few clips provide a really good illustration of how Latin has grown far beyond ancient Rome. Ireland and Norway were never part of the Roman Empire, and South Korea is literally on the other side of the planet. You might be wondering, with that long 2,000-year plus history, why we're going back to the 1st century BC for our pronunciation. Well, the 1st century BC is known as the Golden Age of Latin literature. And throughout the last 2,000 years, people learning Latin and using Latin have looked back to the writers of that time, authors such as Cicero, Caesar, and Virgil, as well as many others, as models of the best Latin usage. So next, in part 3, we'll look at the specifics of how to pronounce classical Latin.